I want you to describe to me sort of in detail what actually happened from the point where you first gave your colleagues feedback they didn't like to you getting fired for giving that feedback. What is that story?
I've been noticing this. Maybe I should just do like a quick summary of what my post was about. Because basically what happened is I posted a summary of the academic literature about Black Lives Matter, which I'd been following because as a data scientist, I was sort of curious about the what was actually coming out of universities in terms of this question. And internally, I had been noticing as this sort of like new racial ideology had spread throughout the company, um, and and it was sort of growing more and more concerned because I knew that the sort of research had been showing that Black Lives Matter was core claim that police are biased towards shooting black people just didn't stand up to scrutiny. It's just untrue. But not only that, that claim had been powering this decrease in policing and increase in violent crime, including all these murders. And I knew that as someone with white skin saying anything about this at Thomson Reuters would be putting my career in jeopardy. But I felt like Reuters had a public trust to be reporting honestly. So what I did was I compiled a summary of the academic literature and I posted it to our internal collaboration platform called the Hub. And just as I expected, that immediately made me the target of this barrage of intensely angry and ultimately highly racialized attacks. And then the company's response to those attacks and this brouhaha was to censor everything I had written and basically shut down any kind of critical examination about the facts of the Black Lives Matter movement. And that was even more concerning to me because now not only were we reporting these falsehoods that were getting people killed, but the company was literally saying, and we're never going to talk about it internally, making it impossible to ever rectify, making it impossible to ever have for our organization to sort of grapple with the facts and correct our reporting. So then I sent an email to senior leadership in the company because so far I'd been dealing with HR and I was hoping, well, maybe senior leadership doesn't know about this whole situation. They're busy with other things. So maybe if I make them aware of this, they'll right the ship. So I sent an email to senior leadership and other colleagues sort of describing how this racialized bullying had made it impossible for us to have a conversation about these facts underlying our news stories and how our news reporting was diverging from those facts. And then they fired me for that.
So,
Does that answer your question?
yeah. I'm curious though, if also you're at Reuters for 5 or 6 years, right? What is the precipitating event that makes you feel I have to write about this topic? Is it something that happened in the news, something that happened at Reuters? What made you feel I have to write an essay and talk to my colleagues about this data?
No, that's a good question. So a couple things. One, I was seeing this ideology, this new racial ideology spread throughout the company, including like uncritical support of the Black Lives Matter movement and its core claims from like senior leadership all the way down. And two, I was seeing Reuters News reporting stories inaccurately and in a distorted way based on that sort of internal racial ideology that had spread throughout the company. And I was, simultaneously.
Can you give any examples? Can you give some example? I know you've written about the Jacob Blake example. Can you give some examples of what you mean by misreporting?
Yeah. So you have examples like Reuters referring to the shooting of Michael Brown as one of a number of egregious examples of lethal police violence, despite the fact that an investigation by the Justice Department run by Barack Obama's Attorney General Eric Holder had cleared the police officer of any wrongdoing. Or you have Reuters referring to a wave of killings of African Americans by police using unjustified force, despite the fact that the statistics clearly show that no such wave had taken place. In fact, police shootings have been on the decline. You have the Jacob Blake example. At some point, Donald Trump said something along the lines of, he pointed out that, more more white suspects are shot by police every year than blacks. And then Reuters fact checked him and repeated what I view as the false claim that blacks are shot disproportionately to whites. And I can explain why I think that's untrue. But so basically,
And just to also to add color to the Jacob Blake example, what you mean is that they did not include in the article that he grabbed a knife and was poised to be about to stab the cops when the cops shot him. So they painted the scene without including that crucial detail.
exactly, yeah. They made sure to mention that he was shot in the back, which was true. But they completely left out that he had just grabbed a knife and he was with arm's length of the police officers, and they thought that he'd been wrestling with them. He'd been, violently resisting arrest, and they were worried that he was going to turn around and stab them. So they would sort of systematically leave out the key contextual details to make the stories much more divisive and inflammatory than they otherwise would be.
One of the examples that most irked me from the past year or two here is Kyle Rittenhouse, who I may it's been a little bit of time now, but I believe he shot 3 people that he was entangled with in various ways. Some of them were attacking him, and he shot 3 of them and killed either one or 2 of them. I don't remember. 1 or 2 survived. Yeah, and all 3 of these people that he shot were white. They all happened to be white, and in most of the mainstream coverage, and certainly most of the mainstream coverage from liberal leaning outlets, it was not mentioned in most of the articles that the people he shot were white. So I ended up talking to a lot of people that kind of make a cursory glance at the news that believed that Kyle Rittenhouse had shot 3 black people, because every article would include the fact that Kyle himself was white. They would say a white man, or a kid really, a white 17-year-old, however old he was, shot 3 people without including their race, so as to leave it ambiguous and let people fill in the blanks with the caricature we have in our heads of white guys with guns killing black people. So many people actually came away from that thinking he killed 3 black people, or he shot 3 black people. And I thought that was a transparent and dishonest, and it was so obvious what the what the conversations were, even if it was only in the head of the journalist writing the article. It was the absence of a description there spoke very loudly to me about the dishonesty that is involved in the description of many of these events.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. There's no way that people weren't that the writers of those articles weren't aware of what they were doing. That's what I've become more and more aware of myself. Is that these are conscious decisions to spin a narrative, and when someone does point out the problems in the reporting, it's a conscious decision then to bury that or to ignore it. These are not just sort of like innocent decisions, and I think you can see that just in terms of like in a lot of Reuters stories, just who they choose to interview and who they choose to ask for a quote. Right? They go out and they'll look for some kind of quote from someone supportive of the BLM movement, but they never include a quote from people who are critical of it or people who can provide context about, well, actually, police are not biased towards shooting black people. And so I'm sure it's not that they never come across those people as they're looking for quotes. It's that those quotes don't fit the narrative, so they leave those out, and they just leave these quotes to give the reader a sense that there's a clear answer.
Okay, so let's get into the actual substantive questions here, because my audience is well acquainted with my critiques of Black Lives Matter, which are very similar to yours. But there are I'm always open to the possibility there are people here thinking, well, how could it be true that black people don't get shot disproportionately by the police? I mean, I know 10 or 15 names off the top of my head, some of which are children, of black people that unarmed that have been shot by the police, and I can't even think of one name of a white person that has been shot by the police. How could it be that my perception, how could I have been radically lied to on such a huge scale so as to be wrong and deeply wrong about this empirical fact? What am I missing?
Yeah. Well, actually, I read one of your articles today where you listed all these white people who had been killed, and I hadn't heard of none of them, and partly I think that's more of a sort of an organic result, which I think you've described in some of your writing, but that's sort of more of an organic result of who's doing the filming and when one of these hits the media or social media, how much views it gets, how much outrage it gets, and then as that's sort of a self-reinforcing cycle where the more outrage these things get, the more you see them, and then the more people assume, well, these are the examples that I'm seeing. I'm not seeing all the examples of white people being shot by the police. I'm seeing examples of black people. So then it becomes like, well, this is literally what you've seen with your own eyes. So I think there is. I'm not. When I sort of was criticizing reporters and journalists a moment ago, I do think that there's this sort of organic thing that sort of almost happened more on its own, in terms of this cycle. But if you're just talking about, it seems like you were prompting me to talk about some of the evidence more than just talk about that cycle.
I was, but actually, now that you mention it, let's get to the evidence in a second. Let's table that for 1 second. I want to address this point because it's extremely important, and in a way, I think it shapes people's opinions even more than the data does. As someone that has looked closely into this issue for years, I know, and I know that every year several dozen white people are killed by the police unarmed. Sometimes those are caught on camera, and the ones that are caught on camera are every bit as galling to watch as the the Alton Sterling video or the George Floyd video. And I've talked on this podcast about Tony Timpa before, who was a white man killed in Dallas with a knee on the back of his upper back for 13 minutes.
Yeah.
And the cops are joking as they crush him into unconsciousness and death. They're joking about him. They're saying, "Wake up, Tony. Go to school." So it's like every bit as disgusting to watch, and most people I talk to still don't know about these videos. There are many other videos of white people unarmed being killed by cops in pretty brutal and unjustified ways.
Now, in Tony Timpa's case, do you think that was an intentional murder, or do you think that they were being callous about the way that they were restraining him, but didn't realize that they were actually killing him?
No, I don't think. I mean, it's very hard to believe that when almost any cop puts a suspect in a hold, that they are intending to murder. I think usually they are neglecting the plausible consequences of their hold for a suspect that is clearly struggling to breathe, and so it's a murder of neglect rather than of intention.
Yeah, neglect, or negligence rather. Yeah, or reckless, like extreme negligence. Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
But, what to close the loop here? What happens is the media doesn't pick it. These things don't become national news events when the suspect happens to have white skin, and that creates the misimpression that this kind of stuff only happens to black people.
Right.
But let's also get into the data a little bit. Black people comprise 13% of the American population, but far more than 13% of those who get shot by the cops full stop and shot by the cops unarmed. Why isn't that smoking gun proof of the fact that there is a racial bias here?
Yeah, I think that gets to the heart of the confusion. So that's basically looking at disproportionality relative to the population. And that doesn't work for a number of reasons. The most important is that we know that different groups have dangerous encounters with the police at wildly different rates. So blacks and whites differ on the total number of violent crimes, the total number of homicides, or the rate of homicides, the rate of resisting arrest, and so forth. So what you really need to do, and each of these creates a different number of situations where police officers legitimately need to use lethal force to protect their lives or the lives of someone else, right? So the question is, how is the question when we're looking for bias is whether or not police are using force disproportionately to those number of situations where they actually legitimately need to use force to defend themselves or someone else. That's what bias in the application of lethal force would mean. Probably the best, easiest measure of how often they need to use lethal force like that is how often police officers are actually murdered by criminals of each group. Now, when you look at it in those terms, I think something along the lines of 37% of the murderers of police officers are black, but only about 24% of the suspects shot by police officers are black. Whereas for whites, it's along the lines of 42% of the murderers of police officers are black. More because there's more white people in the country, so that more white people murder police officers. But they also are shot at a higher rate than that percentage. So they're shot at around roughly 46% of the suspects shot by police are black. So what you see it when you measure it relative to a variable that's relevant to police bias, namely the rate at which police actually need to use to defend themselves because they're at risk of being killed. What you see is that whites are shot disproportionately to the rate at which, for instance, they murder police officers.